Warning, this video contains themes of violence, death, and gang activity. This video is for educational and documentary purposes only. All pictures and images are actual images of the subjects and events from this era. Some images are graphic, and viewers may find them disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. The Detroit River, a vital border between Ontario, Canada, and the United States, has long been one of the busiest waterways in the world. Freighters haul iron ore from the Great Lakes to power Detroit's booming automobile industry, the famed Motor City. Timber barges from the northern forests of Michigan and Wisconsin weave through the narrow channels between Windsor and Detroit on their way to Lake Erie and beyond. However, in winter, this bustling artery freezes solid, bringing shipping to a standstill. But during Prohibition in the 1920s, when alcohol was illegal, the frozen river became something else entirely, a rum runner's paradise. It turned into a highway for smugglers, a lifeline for the illegal liquor trade that fueled the underworld on both sides of the river. The plan to drive across the frozen river was not without mishap though, with cars regularly getting stuck and sinking. The Purple Gang, Detroit's most ruthless criminal organisation. Armed to the teeth, the gang controlled the majority of the city's illegal liquor trade and enforced their power with brutality. The Purple Gang dominated Detroit's rackets through the 1920s and into the early 1930s, and, for a time, the Purples were even powerful enough to issue warnings to Al Capone himself, stopping him from meddling in eastern Michigan. Whilst it might not have been as publicly infamous as the streets of New York or Chicago, Detroit had a criminal underworld that was just as brutal and unforgiving. The Purples were to Detroit what Al Capone and his crew were to Chicago, a commanding, violent force. Their story is one of bloodshed, ambition, and ultimately betrayal, which saw them fight their way to the top of Detroit's criminal empire, maintaining their brutal grip on power for over a decade, until internal disputes led to their dramatic downfall in the early 1930s. Despite this, their legacy is one that still remains felt today. The Purple Gang were the only Jewish crime syndicate to fully control the criminal underworld of a major American city. Known for their brutal methods, they introduced the lethal Tommy gun to Detroit streets, and they are believed to be responsible for over 500 murders, surpassing even Al Capone's body count. Their influence spread far beyond the city, even making its way into pop culture when the iconic lyric in Elvis Presley's Jailhouse Rock, "The whole rhythm section was the Purple Gang," cemented their place in American history. So strap in as we journey back 100 years to the dark, blood-soaked Prohibition-era streets of Detroit and explore the rise and the fall of one of the most notorious gangs in American history. Detroit had a head start in bootlegging thanks to Michigan State's prohibition enacted earlier in 1916. Prominent figures like Henry Ford, who employed over 100,000 workers at his River Rouge plant, championed a sober workforce and enabled an early prohibition in Michigan. Detroiters, however, had other ideas and illegal booze began flowing. And the booze began flowing so freely because the truth was that anyone with a boat could make the short trip across the Detroit River to Canada, and if you didn't actually have a boat, you could just make the drive up to Toledo, Ohio, just 60 miles south, where they would be more than happy to supply thirsty Detroiters with the illegal booze that they craved. Ingenious methods for bringing the booze back to Michigan began emerging. False floorboards in cars, secondary gas tanks, hidden compartments, and even disguised shopping baskets and hot water bottles. This earlier Michigan Prohibition was quite literally just a dress rehearsal of audacity and creativity for the larger operations that the main prohibition, enacted 3 years later, would eventually demand. With the Volstead Act and national prohibition coming into play in 1920, rum runners in Detroit were prepared and got off to a flying start. With the Detroit River less than a mile wide in places and stretching 28 miles with countless coves and hiding spots, it really was a smuggler's dream. Alongside Lake St. Clair and the St. Clair River, these waterways accounted for 75% of the illegal liquor entering the US during Prohibition. Smugglers towed cargo beneath boats, built underground tunnels, and devised underwater cable delivery systems using sunken houseboats. Ingeniously, a pipeline ran from Windsor to Detroit, delivering liquor directly to a bottler. Illegal liquor became Detroit's second largest industry, generating $250 million annually by 1929, second only to automobiles. Approximately 50,000 people in Detroit relied on the alcohol trade for employment, and the city boasted as many as 25,000 speakeasies, or blind pigs, as less reputable bars were known. Corruption was rampant, and authorities often turned a blind eye or participated in the operations themselves. As the demand for liquor soared, informal rum runners gave way to organised crime groups, and Sicilian families like the Bomeritos and the Zerillis controlled operations on Detroit's east side, while the Tallman gang held sway over the west side. Eventually, however, none of these organised crime groups would ever become as dominant as the Purple Gang, who ruled Detroit's underworld with unmatched brutality and audacity. That audacity was on full display when Joseph Kennedy, father of the future president, found himself entangled with the Purples. During Prohibition, Kennedy smuggled liquor through Canada, sourcing it from England and Ireland. However, his operations crossed into Purple Gang territory without their permission. Enraged, the gang marked him for death. Facing this dire threat, Kennedy turned to Chicago mobster Joseph Diamond Joe Esposito, known for his underworld clout. Esposito intervened, negotiating on Kennedy's behalf and ultimately convincing the Purples to lift the contract on his life. Thanks to Diamond Joe, Kennedy narrowly escaped a fatal end to his bootlegging ventures. Like other major cities in the early 20th century, Detroit's impoverished neighbourhoods were fertile ground for crime and violence. The Purple Gang's rise followed a familiar pattern seen in groups like Brooklyn's Five Points Gang or Chicago's Northside Gang. However, the Purples carved a uniquely savage legacy in organised crime. At their peak, the Purple Gang consisted of no more than 50 members, yet their influence extended far beyond their numbers. Through bribes and intimidation, they infiltrated City Hall and the Detroit Police Department, operating with near impunity for years. Their reign of terror was so notorious that even J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, kept close tabs on the gang, as evidenced by this 1933 FBI document detailing their activities. The gang's name, as the story goes, stemmed from a conversation between two stall owners operating in Detroit's Eastern Market. Both men had suffered thefts and vandalism at the hands of the local youths. One, exasperated, reportedly remarked, "These boys are not like other children of their age. They're tainted, off colour." "Yes," the other replied, "they're rotten, purple like the colour of bad meat. They're a Purple Gang." And it was in these Detroit streets that the Purple Gang got their start. Between 1880 and 1924, roughly 4 million Jewish immigrants from Russia, Poland and the Austro-Hungarian Empire arrived in the United States, with many opting to settle in Detroit over New York, drawn by the city's flourishing industrial economy. Over the course of a decade, from 1910 to 1920, Detroit's immigrant population more than doubled, propelling the city to become the 4th largest in the country, up from 7th place. By the end of the 1920s, nearly 29% of Detroit's residents were foreign-born. This period marked the city's rapid growth as the most dynamic urban centre in the post-World War I era. The automobile industry was booming and job opportunities in the factories and steel mills were abundant. Detroit experienced a building boom that transformed its downtown area, leaving a legacy of monumental structures. Notable examples include the 15-story Maccabees building, the 29-story Buck Cadillac Hotel, the 36-story Guardian building, which was often referred to as the Cathedral of Finance, and the towering 47-story Penobscot building, which still holds the title of Detroit's tallest skyscraper. Alongside these developments, the city's cultural scene flourished with landmarks like the Main Library, the Wayne State University, and the Detroit Institute of Arts, all being erected. The 1920s also saw the completion of the Ambassador Bridge to Canada and the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel in 1930, both of which became crucial routes for international trade and illicit alcohol smuggling during Prohibition. Detroit's rise as an industrial powerhouse made it a magnet for all kinds of entrepreneurs, including criminals eager to capitalise on the city's wealth and opportunities. Unlike other major cities such as New York, Detroit's growth was outward, not upward, due to the abundance of flat farmland surrounding the urban core. The auto factories radiating out from downtown were surrounded by miles of modest 1 and 2 family wood frame houses, their streets lined with elm and maple trees. In most neighbourhoods, the tallest structures to be seen were smokestacks from the factories or steeples of churches, while the skyline was dominated by the rising presence of industry and the growing urban sprawl. The Jewish community in Detroit, much like previous waves of immigrant groups, often settled in the city's most poorest neighbourhoods, specifically within an area called Paradise Valley. While their housing in this area was often old and deteriorating, it was a far cry from the cramped, sunlight-deprived tenement buildings in New York City, which left little room for children to play. Most of the gang were the children of Russian and Polish immigrants who had fled persecution and the rising tide of anti-Semitism in Europe. While the opportunities that European immigrants had hoped for in America were often marred by the grim realities of life in overcrowded, poverty-stricken tenements, they nevertheless managed to cultivate a distinct Yiddish culture within their communities. This culture, rich in literature, music and song, frequently focused on the struggles of the immigrant worker trying to adapt to an often hostile environment. In adapting to their new life, Jews in Detroit preserved elements of their old world and built a thriving ethnic market community. The streets were lined with businesses that catered to their own: dry goods stores, bakeries, delicatessens, fish markets, vegetable pushcarts, drugstores, hotels, boarding houses and barbershops. Alongside these there were saloons, pool halls and pawn shops, providing further evidence of the community's resilience and resourcefulness in the face of hardship. Jewish immigrant parents, often with large families, found themselves struggling to meet the needs of their children in a country that was entirely new to them. Their children, however, were eager to break free from the constraints of the ghetto and climb the social ladder as quickly as possible. For some, this drive led them down a criminal path. The original members of the Purple Gang were segregated into the upper floors of the old Bishop's School, which was designed to train delinquent youth for manual labour jobs, preparing them for a future spent working in Detroit's sweatshops and factories. These boys saw their parents and neighbours return home each evening exhausted from long hours of low-paying work. The idea of becoming just another cog in the machinery of the booming automobile industry held little appeal for these restless teenagers. Led by the Bernstein brothers, Abe, Joe, Raymond and Izzy, the gang quickly evolved. Other key members included Harry and Phil Keywell, Harry, Sam and Louis Fleischer and Irving Shapiro. These young men grew up in the Hastings Street neighbourhood on Detroit's southeast side, known as Little Jerusalem by its Jewish residents and Paradise Valley by just about everyone else. The area was a dilapidated district populated by impoverished factory workers and shopkeepers. Many of these boys started out as newsboys, quickly learning the ways of the streets. They bought newspapers in bulk at 2 for a nickel and sold them individually for a nickel each, doubling their money in the process. Their prime street corner, just outside the entrance of Detroit's Eastern Market, became their most valuable asset. It had to be defended at all costs to keep competitors away. Staking their claim to this street corner and protecting it fiercely from rival newspaper sellers, which often ended in fights and scuttles. Growing up in such an environment made them tough, and Joseph and Raymond Bernstein in particular learned early on that threats and violence were essential tools for establishing dominance over their territory. What began as petty street crime soon escalated. The Bernstein brothers, along with their gang, graduated from simple hooliganism to more serious offences like armed robbery, hijacking, extortion, bombing, kidnapping, and eventually murder. By the early 1920s, the young criminals were taken under the wing of the leaders of the Oakland Sugar House Gang, Charles Leiter and Henry Shaw. Although they ran a legitimate business selling corn sugar and home beer brewing supplies from their headquarters on Oakland Street, hence their name, their true operation was a front to launder money earned from their illegal hijacking, extortion and distillery dealings. The Sugar House Gang set up their operations in unused warehouses and abandoned barns in the countryside, where they supplied raw materials for large-scale brewing plants and distilleries. Sammy Cohen, a member of the Sugar House Gang, took the men under his guidance, teaching them the ins and outs of hijacking, collecting protection money from speakeasies, and as the Purple Gang grew in both wealth and influence, they expanded their criminal operations into owning speakeasies, nightclubs and gambling establishments of their own. Their reach stretched further as their empire grew, and when they needed extra muscle, they turned to outside sources. The Purples brought in enforcers from New York City, including Eddie Fletcher, Abe Axler and Irving Milberg, and recruited several former members of St. Louis's Egan Rats, such as Johnny Reed, Milford Jones, Gus Winkler and Fred the Killer Burke. Soon, the rest of the underworld took notice of their expanding power as Detroit entered into the peak years of Prohibition. Prohibition officially began on January the 17th, 1920, but Detroit had already gained a head start in bootlegging thanks to Henry Ford's push for a sober workforce. Ford played a key role in Michigan State's prohibition of liquor, which was enacted in 1916 and took effect a year later. This early Prohibition period gave Detroit 3 years to prepare before the national ban was implemented. When national prohibition initially went into effect, many Michiganders simply just crossed into Ohio to purchase alcohol. However, as the Michigan State Police began cracking down on offenders crossing state lines, Detroit's proximity to Windsor in Ontario provided a strategic advantage. Detroit was just a short distance away from Canadian distilleries and breweries, and river smuggling became rampant. Before the opening of the International Ambassador Bridge on November the 15th, 1929, and the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel a year later in 1930, many Detroit residents relied on the Walkerville and Detroit ferry service to cross the Detroit River. With Prohibition in full effect, an underground network of smuggling operations flourished, as otherwise law-abiding citizens devised creative ways to circumvent the unpopular alcohol ban. Bottle harnesses were worn under clothing, pockets were sewn into overcoats, and secret compartments were built into cars to transport illicit booze across the border. The international boundary between the US and Canada was practically a sieve. Some Detroiters resorted to canoes, rowboats and sailboats to ferry alcohol across the river. They would load their boats with contraband and return without much resistance, sometimes making multiple trips a day. In the winter, when the river froze, large sleds powered by teams of men would haul alcohol across the ice. Old Model T Fords, purchased cheaply for $5 to $10, were often used to cross frozen sections of Lake St. Clair and Lake Erie, ensuring that smuggling routes remained open. To make the loading and unloading of liquor quicker and to offer the driver a better chance of escape if the ice broke, the roofs and doors of the cars were removed. Whilst a car sinking through the ice was a risk, with the roofs and the doors removed, the smugglers lost only the value of the alcohol that couldn't be recovered, and not their lives. By 1921, the smugglers faced another threat as the Purple Gang began hijacking liquor shipments and eliminating uncooperative smugglers, driving amateurs out of the business. The larger, more established gangs soon carved out territories along the waterfront, turning liquor smuggling into a lucrative criminal enterprise. The Purple Gang controlled the Detroit River, whilst the Italian East Side mob, run by Joe Zerilli and William Black Bill Tocco, dominated the St. Clair River and Lake St. Clair. The Italian West Side mob, led by Cesare Lemaire and Joe Tocco, no relation to Black Bill, ruled the Rouge River southward to Lake Erie. Despite their territorial overlaps, the three criminal groups managed to cooperate relatively well, with the Purple Gang acting as a neutral force between the two rival mafia factions. The East Side mob consisted of traditional Sicilian criminals who adhered to old world ways, whilst the West Side mob sought modernisation, eager to expand their operations across ethnic lines and partner with Jewish, Irish and Polish gangs. Each major player had a lot of territory, and it wasn't long before Detroit was littered with speakeasies and blind pigs, as the factions needed a place to sell their smuggled alcohol. Speakeasies catered to a wealthier crowd compared to blind pigs, which primarily served blue-collar workers and offered whiskey by the shot or beer by the glass. Blind pigs were often hidden in apartments, basements and garages, or behind the scenes of legitimate businesses. In contrast, speakeasies evolved into upscale nightclubs, offering live entertainment in the form of blues and jazz, pioneered by African American artists. The Purple Gang maintained working relationships with other crime groups, including their mafia counterparts, and this ethnic cooperation played a significant role in their mutual success. The Purples were pragmatic, aligning with anyone who could help them reach their primary goal, making substantial profits with minimal effort. Initially, the Purple Gang became notorious for hijacking liquor shipments rather than smuggling. Hijacking from rival gangs and independent bootleggers offered more immediate profit with less risk, rather than running their own smuggling operations. As their operations expanded, the Purples needed a reliable supply chain. They enlisted freelance smugglers to bring liquor and beer into their territory, requiring them to either pay a fee per case or hand over a percentage of their haul. Any resistance to the Purple Gang's demands was met with violent retribution, the likes of which Joseph Kennedy narrowly escaped when he tried to move booze through Detroit without the gang's permission. Over time, they expanded their reach by granting franchise rights to a subsidiary gang, the 3rd Street Terrors, which the Detroit police dubbed the Little Jewish Navy. The group was equipped with a fleet of speedboats, allowing them to quickly transport Canadian whiskey across the Detroit River. Government sources later estimated that 75% of all alcohol smuggled into the US during Prohibition came through the Detroit River, a meteoric percentage which earned it the nickname the Detroit Windsor Funnel. In 1925, as Al Scarface Capone sought to expand his operations, he realised that his Midwestern network couldn't meet the growing demand for liquor. Capone's attention turned eastward, where just a mile of water separated Detroit from Canada's distilleries and breweries. To set up a steady supply line, Capone arranged a clandestine meeting at the Fort Shelby Hotel in Detroit with the Purple Gang. In the privacy of a well-secured dining room, Abe Bernstein represented the gang. Abe was the business mind behind the gang, managing several legitimate businesses used as fronts for their money laundering activities. Abe commanded the gang's payroll, where he had most of the Detroit police, judges, and even Mayor Charles Bowles on the Purple Gang's payroll. His brother Joe was the public face of the gang, a stylish frontman skilled in negotiations. Ray Bernstein was the enforcer, the muscle behind the gang's operations. If Ray came to collect, it was best not to resist. Isidore, known as Izzy, the youngest Bernstein brother, operated mostly behind the scenes, quietly overseeing the gang's gambling interests and leaving the daily operations to his older siblings. Abe Bernstein told Al Capone, just like he told Joseph Kennedy a couple of years earlier, that the Purple Gang controlled all the liquor traffic on the Detroit River and that they took a cut of anything that crossed into or through their territory. The Purples were adamant that they would not relinquish any part of their waterfront to an outsider. Capone, however, had absolutely no desire to engage in a turf war with Detroit's most notorious criminal faction, and he complied. At this time, Scarface had enough on his plate managing his Chicago operations after taking over the outfit from Johnny Torrio, who had recently narrowly survived an assassination attempt from their rivals, the Northside Gang, and now Capone was more focused on avoiding further conflict. As a result, Capone and the Purple Gang struck a deal that made the Purples his exclusive suppliers of uncut bonded Canadian whiskey, including Capone's favourite brand, Old Log Cabin Bourbon, sourced from Montreal. The Purples agreed to allocate as much bonded Canadian liquor as possible for Capone's needs, ensuring its safe passage to St. Joseph, Michigan, where Capone's men would take over and move it into Chicago. Capone promised that there was plenty of money to be made for everyone involved, and the deal was sealed with a handshake. Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik, Capone's trusted lieutenant, handed the Bernstein brothers a briefcase containing $30,000 in startup funds, about $500,000 today. The news that the Purple Gang had partnered with the Capone organisation quickly spread through Detroit's criminal circles, boosting the Purple Gang's credibility and making them virtually untouchable. No one in the city dared to challenge their authority now they were partnered with Capone. To balance the books, however, occasionally corrupt Prohibition agents staged highly publicised raids on the Purple Gang's establishments to give the illusion of cracking down on illegal operations. This image captures one such moment, where agents theatrically poured barrels of liquor from the windows of a downtown Detroit blind pig owned by the gang. Conveniently, a newspaper photographer was invited to document the spectacle, ensuring the public believed the authorities were taking decisive action against the Purple's thriving bootlegging empire. While many corrupt Prohibition agents and police officials turned a blind eye to the Purple Gang's operations, a handful of determined journalists sought to expose their illegal activities. Some went as far as following and documenting the gang's bootlegging operations in action, like this image of Purple Gang members unloading a boat full of illicit booze. These brave efforts were often in vain, as the photographs and reports sent to law enforcement frequently fell on deaf ears. Police in Detroit, incentivized by the bribes Abe Bernstein and the gang handed out weekly, largely ignored the evidence. And public sentiment didn't exactly favour the prohibition laws either. In places like Hamtramck, a Detroit suburb, residents openly mocked the ban on alcohol, and, as seen in this photograph, locals cruised around in cars bearing slogans like "We want beer," leaving little doubt about their stance on prohibition. So the demand for liquor evidently remained high, and this meant that for several years the partnership between Al Capone and the Purple Gang prospered. However, the balance of power began to shift when the federal government increased its efforts to suppress bootlegging. So as a result of the scrutiny from the small percentage of the population who were actually law-abiding and favoured the prohibition laws, the government had to deploy large sums of money, which were used to create Coast Guard patrols and the hiring of additional prohibition agents, which began to take a toll on the illegal liquor trade. The Little Jewish Navy, a faction of the Purple Gang that specialised in smuggling liquor across the Detroit River, found itself in a more precarious situation. With President Herbert Hoover intensifying the federal crackdown on bootlegging, smuggling operations became increasingly risky, and the costs of doing business escalated. The more dangerous the journey from Canada became, the higher the price for those willing to take the risk. In the early days of Prohibition, federal law enforcement struggled to effectively curb the flow of illegal liquor from Canada due to a lack of resources. The federal government simply did not have enough patrol boats or personnel to monitor the border, allowing smugglers to operate with relative ease. However, by the spring of 1925, the situation began to shift. The federal government increased funding, hiring more prohibition agents and Coast Guard personnel, and outfitting them with powerful patrol boats equipped with machine guns mounted on their bows. As speedboat technology advanced, bootleggers, now with more disposable income, commissioned sleeker and faster boats to evade capture. The smugglers developed increasingly sophisticated evasive strategies, but the balance was starting to tip in favour of law enforcement. When river smuggling became too risky, traffickers found alternative routes for bringing liquor across the international border. One of the most significant methods was the use of the Michigan Central Train Tunnel, which ran beneath the Detroit River. With its heavy flow of commercial traffic, the tunnel was rarely scrutinised by police, and large quantities of illegal liquor passed through unnoticed. This allowed smugglers to ship alcohol nationwide with minimal consequences. In addition to the river and tunnel routes, Al Capone deployed a fresh strategy to bypass the increased law enforcement presence. Capone purchased a fleet of surplus Curtiss JN-4D bombers from World War I and hired experienced pilots from the Selfridge Aero Squadron base. These planes were used to fly daily shipments of liquor from Canada into Michigan. Each bomber's bomb bay could hold 25 cases, equating to 300 bottles of alcohol. The loading process was quick, taking no more than 10 minutes, and after the planes were loaded, the pilots would deliver a bundle of cash wrapped in butcher paper to Blaise Dysburg, known in the liquor business as King Canada, and he was the Purple Gang's main supplier and organiser across the river. The Purples and Capone's operation relied heavily on Dysburg, who was in charge of organising the shipments. Dysburg would personally negotiate the deals with Capone and Abe Bernstein in the basement of his brother's house in Belle River, Ontario. He filled out the official Canadian B-13 export papers and made cash payments for the shipments. Once the alcohol was secured, it was delivered to one of the 5 farm fields Dysburg leased in rural Canada. Dysburg was a one-man operation, personally loading the 25 cases of liquor into the bombers before they took off for Michigan. This innovative airborne smuggling operation made Dysburg a very wealthy man. The bootlegging operation was kept in the shadows, and it wasn't until 1924 that the Purple Gang first gained widespread attention in Detroit when they became linked to an event known as the Cleaners and Dyers War. In early 1924, the laundry industry in Detroit was engulfed in a price war that led to significant reductions in cleaning and pressing costs, ultimately causing large wholesale cleaning plants to operate at a loss. By 1925, a power struggle emerged for control over the industry. Charles Jacob, a legitimate businessman and owner of the French Dyers and Cleaners, Francis Martel, president of the Detroit Federation of Labor, and Abe Bernstein, Jacob's brother-in-law and a silent partner, formed a collusive agreement with the aim of regulating and controlling the prices within the cleaning industry. Together, they established the Wholesale Cleaners and Dyers Association, with Jacob as the association's first president. Jacob quickly imposed dues on cleaning plant owners, initially at $25 a week, but this was soon increased to 2% of all cleaning plant owners' pre-tax profits, putting significant financial pressure on business owners. As the labour racket took hold, Jacob, Martel and Bernstein skimmed money from the dues, using part of it to fund a campaign of terror against those who refused to join their association. For the strong-arm tactics, the union's board of directors enlisted the help of younger men to carry out the more violent and public activities. At the same time, Abe Bernstein enlisted the help of his younger brothers, Joe and Ray, along with their street-hardened associates, to act as enforcers and recruiters, coercing reluctant laundry operators into compliance. The Purple Gang's violent tactics went unchallenged for the best part of a year, creating widespread fear in the laundry industry. Some independent operators who didn't want to comply with the gang went out of business, others faced physical violence, and some mysteriously disappeared or fled the city. Despite the intimidation, the general public remained unaware that organised crime had infiltrated the industry until on December the 9th, 1925, when the body of Samuel Sigmund, the secretary of the Perfect Dyers and Cleaners Association and one who refused the advances of the Purple Gang, was found on the streets with 3 gunshot wounds, a broken neck and crushed ribs. A clear connection to the wholesale cleaners was found, but no evidence to the murder was, and the case was eventually closed. In early 1926, the murder of Samuel Polakov, vice president of the Union Cleaners and Dyers Company, further exposed to the public that organised crime was controlling the industry. Polakov was found brutally beaten to death with a hammer in the backseat of his car. It's thought that he also didn't want to play ball with the newly formed Wholesale Cleaners and Dyers Association, so the Purple Gang took him out. The sheer brutality of the murder shattered the silence that had protected the Purple Gang. In response, 10 cleaning plant operators, fearing for their safety, came forward to share their experiences with police detectives, revealing the reign of terror that the industry had endured for the past 3 years. Francis Martel, who had distanced himself from Jacob and Bernstein after a business dispute, eventually turned against them. He convinced several cleaning plant operators to press charges against Jacob Bernstein and their Purple Gang enforcers. As a result, the 16 most notable members of the Purple Gang were arrested in the back of Jacob's French Dyers and Cleaners business. The arrested gang members included Joe, Ray, Abe and Izzy Bernstein, Harry and Sam Fleischer, Philip and Harry Keywell, Abe Axler, Eddie Fletcher, Ziggy Selbin, Irving Shapiro, Morris Rader, Irving Milberg, Harry Millman and Milford Jones. The group was photographed, fingerprinted and held on charges of extortion. The trial became a very high-profile spectacle, covered daily on the front of all of Detroit's newspapers. However, after a 3-week-long proceeding, the jury took less than an hour to come back with a not guilty verdict for every single defendant. Despite the case's failure to yield a conviction, it ended the Cleaners and Dyers War and cemented the Purple Gang's reputation for being untouchable. The extensive media coverage throughout the trial and its aftermath thrust the Purple Gang into the public spotlight, giving them a sort of marquee status in the underworld. The truth was that the Purple Gang were untouchable and were pretty much immune from prosecution. Whilst many members of the gang accumulated long criminal records, authorities were consistently unable to secure convictions. A combination of skilled lawyers, strategic payoffs to key figures, and an overwhelming lack of witnesses willing to testify created the illusion that the gang was beyond legal reach. The Purples, primarily Jewish criminals, struck fear into their community, demonstrating an uncanny willingness to use extreme violence against anyone who opposed them. Victims of their crimes were too terrified to come forward, and potential witnesses often disappeared without a trace. Sometimes the bodies of rivals, betrayers or informants would be discovered lifeless on the streets or floating in the Detroit River, making their way towards Lake Erie. Double-crossing the gang could lead to certain death, even for police officers. On January the 30th, 1926, patrolman Vivian Welch met a brutal end after attempting to extort more money from the Purple Gang's speakeasies. Welch, a 27-year-old officer, had been accepting his routine payoffs from the gang to turn a blind eye to their activities, but decided to demand more from the gang, threatening to expose them if they didn't comply. This decision sealed his fate. While off duty and dressed in plain clothes, Welch got into the back of a Chevrolet Roadster driven by Harry Millman to negotiate his additional payoff he had demanded. Shortly into the journey, Welch realised that he'd been set up and jumped from the moving car near St Aubin Street and Faber Avenue in Hamtramck, attempting to flee. The driver slammed on the brakes and Harry Millman and another Purple Gang member emerged from the back seat, chasing after him while firing their pistols. One of the shots struck Welch in the back, bringing him down. The assailants quickly approached the fallen officer and executed him with 8 more shots to the head. Afterwards, they quickly returned to the car and the driver ran over Welch's body as they sped away, just to make sure. Predictably, no one was ever brought to justice for Welch's murder, but the killing did solidify the Purple Gang's reputation of being ruthless and unforgiving. A few months after, the Oakland Sugar House Gang was dismantled and many of its key members were imprisoned for their involvement in illegal distilleries. The remaining members of the Oakland Sugar House Gang who were not incarcerated were absorbed into the Purple Gang's expanding operations. The line between the two gangs blurred and the Purple Gang's ranks were bolstered considerably. The now enlarged Purple Gang's primary source of revenue stemmed from bootlegging, but their second largest income came from gambling. Abe Bernstein, the unofficial leader of the gang, launched his gambling career as a dealer and stickman in some of Detroit's more prestigious gambling establishments. It was in these venues that Abe cultivated valuable connections with many of Detroit's influential figures, both inside and outside of the government. Although he was a small, non-threatening figure physically, Abe's charm and network of high-powered associates gave him significant influence. His political connections proved crucial in helping many members of the Purple Gang evade charges and secure their release from jail. These ties to power were a wellspring of strength for Abe, giving him a form of protection and leverage within Detroit's underworld. In the mid-1920s, Abe and his younger brothers expanded their operations into the horse racing wire service business. They established a network of over 700 betting parlours across the greater Detroit area, each of which was required to subscribe to their service. These parlours had to pay a percentage of earnings back to the Purple Gang, making it a highly profitable venture. To control the flow of race results, Abe and Joe bribed teletype operators at the Western Union and the Telegraph Company to delay the release of results from Eastern tracks. The race outcomes were only passed on to the bookies after the Bernsteins had received them, allowing them to manipulate the betting process. If a horse lost, the bookie would accept the bet. If a horse won, the bookie would announce the race has closed. This manipulation allowed the Bernsteins to maximise their profits by stacking the odds in their favour. In addition to the wire service, the Purple Gang ran another gambling racket involving the kidnapping of wealthy and influential gamblers for ransom. These victims, dubbed by the press as part of the snatch racket, were often coerced into paying large sums of money to avoid public embarrassment, or worse, a brutal beating, or even being dumped in the Detroit River. The fear surrounding these kidnappings escalated after a particularly violent event, the Mila Flores massacre, which struck terror into both the public and the criminal underworld. This grisly incident highlighted the lengths to which the Purple Gang would go to control the gambling scene and solidified their reputation for ruthlessness. By mid-1926, the Purple Gang had formed a strategic alliance with former members of the Egan's Rats Gang, particularly Fred the Killer Burke and Gus Winkler. These men, along with their associates, became responsible for distributing the Purple Gang's liquor and carrying out any necessary strong-arm work. However, trouble began to brew on Christmas night in 1926 when saloon keeper Johnny Reed was shotgunned to death behind his apartment building at 3025 East Grand Boulevard. Johnny Reed was a Purple Gang liquor agent and former Egan Rat, and the prime suspect in Reed's murder was Frank Wright. Sadly, no photographs of Wright have survived, but he was a Chicago-based jewel thief and general wrongdoer who had recently moved to Detroit. Wright, along with two New York burglars, Joseph Bloom and George Cohen, began kidnapping local gamblers for ransom, many of whom had ties to the Purple Gang, like Johnny Reed. Their reckless behaviour crossed a deadly line when they gunned down purple drug peddler Jake Weinberg in Detroit's North End on February 3rd, 1927. In response, the Bernstein brothers hired Fred Burke and Gus Winkler to take revenge on the killers. Wright was lured into a trap when his friend, Mayor Bloomfield, was kidnapped by Fred Burke. Gus Winkler contacted Frank Wright and told him that he could recover his friend at apartment 308 of the Mila Flores apartments located at 106 East Alexandrine Avenue. At 4:30 a.m. on March 28, 1927, Frank Wright, along with Joseph Bloom and George Cohen, arrived at the Mila Flores apartments and knocked on the door of apartment 308. As they did, the fire door at the end of the hallway opened and three men unleashed a barrage of pistol and submachine gun fire. All three gangsters were struck and collapsed to the ground. The shooters quickly fled down the back stairway once their guns were emptied. Bloom and Cohen were pronounced dead at the scene. They'd been so severely shot that the coroner could not determine how many bullets had struck them, but it's estimated that there was over 100. Frank Wright, despite being hit by 14 bullets, was still alive. When asked if he could identify the killers, he weakly replied, "The machine gun worked. That's all I can remember." Frank Wright succumbed to his injuries approximately 20 hours later. Suspecting the Purple Gang were involved, the day after the massacre, 3 Detroit police officers pulled over a car on Woodward Avenue and arrested Abe Axler and Fred Burke. Though both men were suspects in the murders, neither was charged, and the investigation, all too typically, went cold. The Mila Flores slayings, in all their gruesomeness, marked a turning point in Detroit's criminal landscape. This was the first documented use of a Thompson submachine gun in the city's history, and the Purple Gang left behind 110 bullet holes as a stark warning to any rivals. Despite arrests, no convictions followed, a recurring theme in the Purple Gang's operations, as fear and intimidation silenced potential witnesses. The massacre cemented the Purple Gang's reputation in Detroit for complete brutality and savagery. The Capone-Purple Gang relationship grew deeper when Capone's patience with George Bugs Moran and his Northside gang in Chicago finally wore thin. A violent and bloody gang war between the two factions had ravaged both sides. After much bloodshed, A fragile truce was established, with Capone continuing to supply Moran's crew with bonded Canadian whiskey. However, Moran soon found the wholesale prices too steep for his liking and expressed his displeasure. Al Capone devised a clever scheme to rid Chicago of Moran and his crew once and for all. He had Abe Bernstein contact Bugs Moran, telling him that they had hijacked a Capone shipment and were offering to sell it at a discount so long as Capone didn't find out. On the morning of February the 14th, 1929, 7 members of the Moran gang gathered at the SMC Cartage Company, the gang's headquarters, waiting for the shipment to arrive. But instead of goods, they were met with a brutal surprise. 2 gunmen disguised as police officers stormed in, lined the men up against the wall, and coldly executed them. A police investigation into the massacre at the SMC Cartage Company led to the discovery of 2 landladies who operated on North Clark Street who had seen 3 suspicious cab drivers renting rooms near the scene of the murders just days before the killings. These women identified the men as known Purple Gang members Harry Keywell, Phil Keywell and Eddie Fletcher after seeing their mugshots. When Chicago police reached out to the lead of Detroit's crime and bomb squad, Inspector Henry J. Garvin, he confirmed that the Keywells and Fletcher had been under surveillance in Detroit around the time of the massacre. The Chicago police persisted for evidence that the Keywells and Fletcher were actually in Detroit at the time of the massacre. However, for reasons that remain unclear, though one could suspect that his wallet was just a tad fatter that day, Inspector Garvin dismissed the inquiry. As a result, no connection was made between the Purple Gang members and the murders. The case was never brought to trial, and the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre remained unsolved. If they were involved, the Purple Gang faced no consequences for their actions. 3 months after the St. Valentine's Day massacre, on May the 13th, 1929, the infamous Atlantic City Conference took place. The gathering brought together the most powerful figures in organised crime from across the United States, a who's who of the criminal underworld. Amongst the attendees were Al Capone, Dutch Schultz, Oni Madden and many others. It was a momentous occasion, reflecting the growing influence and reach of the nation's crime syndicates. Abe Bernstein and his brother Ray were also invited, a clear sign of their rising stature in the world of organised crime. The conference was convened to address the escalating violence that had been spreading across major cities from Chicago to New York, leaving bodies in its wake. The leaders agreed that the rampant bloodshed was bad for business as it drew unwanted attention from law enforcement and jeopardised their illicit operations. The solution, they decided, was to call a ceasefire and curb the ongoing turf wars. Though the meeting seemed to stop the blood flowing in Chicago and New York, in Detroit it had only just begun. On the night of July the 27th, 1929, a quiet neighbourhood in Detroit was abruptly disturbed by the sound of gunshots. The occupants of 2464 Taylor Street noticed a body in the street outside their home and immediately called the police. Upon their arrival, they mentioned seeing a grey touring car speeding away from the scene. Skid marks and evidence suggested the car had abruptly stopped before dumping the body in the street. Police identified the victim as 25-year-old Irving Shapiro, a feared Purple Gang extortionist. The labels had been cut from his clothing, likely to delay identification, but his expensive watch suggested robbery wasn't the motive. Shapiro had been taken out by fellow Purple Gang members for skimming profits from his takings and causing unrest within the ranks. This marked the first of the internal conflicts in the gang. Shapiro was the first Purple Gang member to fall victim to what would eventually become known as a ride. His murder, in fact, was particularly humiliating as he was killed in his own car, which was found 3 days later on sale at a used car lot. Shapiro had been a major moneymaker for the Purple Gang, extorting $8,000 a month from the Plumbers Union and running a lucrative racket in the building trades. He was widely feared among law enforcement and in the underworld, which made the decision to take him out an absolute huge one from Abe Bernstein and the rest of the Purple Gang. Despite Shapiro's death, extortion and violence continued. One of Shapiro's associates, 22-year-old Zygmunt Witkowski, known in the criminal world as Ziggy Selbin, took over Shapiro's criminal activities and joined the Purple Gang. A violent and unpredictable individual, Selbin specialised in robbery, extortion and murder and was universally feared and hated across Detroit. His reckless nature and frequent drinking binges made him a dangerous liability. On one occasion, while dining in a downtown restaurant, Selbin attempted to buy a man's ring. When the man refused, Selbin savagely attacked him, cutting off the man's finger with a knife to steal the ring in front of a shocked restaurant. Cutting off fingers was a tactic Selbin used in his extortion methods, and one that he gained particular pleasure from. This kind of volatile public violence created problems for the Purple Gang's business operations. Selbin's actions caught the attention of Cesare Big Chet Lamare, a vice lord in Hamtramck, who was an important ally of the Purple Gang. Lamare complained to Abe Bernstein about Selbin's ongoing robberies, where he was targeting businesses protected by Lamare's crew. To prevent a costly gang war, Bernstein decided that Selbin needed to be eliminated. On October the 27th, 1929, exactly 3 months after Shapiro's murder, Selbin was ambushed by an unidentified Purple Gang hitman. After being caught without his firearm, Selbin attempted to flee but was cornered in a stairwell on 12th Street. The gunman calmly emptied 5 shots into him and then casually walked away, his face hidden beneath his fedora, a cold execution that marked the end of Selbin's violent reign. This internal murder caught the eye of Henry J. Garvin. Inspector Garvin was one of the most infamous figures in Detroit's Prohibition-era law enforcement force. He was leading the newly established crime and bomb squad tasked with investigating and bringing down the Purple Gang. This was a position which, after turning against the gang having once taken their bribes, made him a prime target. On the morning of January the 2nd, 1930, as Inspector Garvin drove to police headquarters in an unmarked car, his enemies made their move. At 7:30 AM, 3 gunmen ambushed him. Shots rang out, shattering the rear window of his car. 1 bullet grazed his neck as the attacker's vehicle pulled alongside his. A barrage of automatic pistol and shotgun fire tore into Garvin's car, forcing him to swerve to the curb in a desperate attempt to escape the onslaught. Despite his best efforts, Garvin was hit multiple times in his neck, left arm and torso before collapsing onto his wheel, gravely wounded. The gunmen sped away, leaving the inspector for dead. Henry Garvin miraculously survived, but the brazen attack on such a prominent lawman shocked the city. Public outrage surged and the press demanded action. The Detroit police, mostly in the pockets of the Purple Gang, ignored the pressure as best they could, but the brutal slaying of a boy 6 months later forced the authorities to take action. Detroit speakeasies and blind pigs were notorious for the harsh quality of their whiskey. Only the Purple Gang's best customers paying top dollar, like Al Capone, would receive full-strength bonded Canadian liquor. What product they couldn't smuggle across the Detroit River, the Purple Gang hijacked. To increase their supplies and profits, it was standard practice to cut the genuine article for their less discriminating customers. A cutting plant was an easy operation to set up. Used bottles were collected and rinsed but never sterilised. Next, the good stuff was split up into 3 bottles. High-proof medicinal alcohol, or White Lightning from neighbourhood stills, was diluted with water to reach the approximate 80 proof of the original.
coal tar extract or some other colouring agent was added to achieve the proper amber tint of whiskey, and flavourings were added to cut the harshness. Lastly, counterfeit labels and revenue stamps were attached to the bottles to make it look authentic. With no quality control, the final product could make users sick or blind. Some people died from contaminated, doctored booze, and others suffered from shaky leg, which was tremors. All of that was of no concern to the Purple Gang, however. Large profits were their only motivation. The Purple Gang operated several such cutting plants across the city, but a cutting plant hidden in an old barn within the gang's territory at Hendry Avenue and Hastings Street showed what lengths the gang would go to protect their secret plants. On July the 22nd, 1930, Purple gangsters Maurice Rader and Philip Keywell were busy cutting liquor when they heard something outside the barn. The two men were jumpy and quickly looked to see what had made the sound. A teen had lifted a hinged barn window and looked in. The gang feared he was spying on them and might come back with his friends to steal their liquor or rat them out to police. Rader and Keywell chased a 17-year-old boy, an ice peddler called Arthur Mixon, and confronted him in an alley. Rader and Mixon exchanged heated remarks before Maurice Rader told 21-year-old Phil Keywell, "Let's put him on the spot."
The alley echoed with 3 gunshots that pierced Mixon's back as he tried to escape. The shooting was witnessed by 4 of Mixon's friends, who all scattered. The gangsters rushed to the barn, locked it up, and fled the scene. The next day, Keywell and Rader were arrested by Detroit police after Arthur Mixon's friends pointed them out as the attackers. After a short trial, Philip Keywell and Maurice Rader were sentenced to life in prison. Not 24 hours after the murder of Arthur Mixon, the Purple Gang spilled blood on the streets of Detroit again. This time, it was more public than ever.
Gangland violence was so pervasive in 1930 that Detroit reporters dubbed the era as the Bloody 30s. In July alone, 14 men were killed, with all but 3 tied to the rackets. Among the year's most shocking events was the murder of Jerry Buckley, a popular and outspoken radio commentator. Buckley hosted the Buckley Hour, a nightly programme on WMBC from 6 to 7. During which he openly criticised the corrupt administration of Mayor Charles Bowles, a politician controlled by Purple Gang leader Abe Bernstein. Buckley became Bowles' most vocal media adversary, frequently condemning the surge in crime since Bowles assumed office and accusing his administration of colluding with organised crime. His fierce rhetoric made the Buckley Hour Detroit's most popular radio show, attracting listeners eager to hear his scathing attacks on political corruption and mob influence.
On July the 23rd, 1930, Jerry Buckley was in the radio studio delivering a special report on the recall election aimed at ousting Mayor Charles Bowles. Buckley had been a main instigator in starting the recall election, which is basically just an election that allows voters to remove a mayor from office by signing a petition. At midnight, it was announced that the votes were in and Bowles had been beaten. The public wanted him out. Coincidentally, that same evening, Jerry Buckley received a call from an unidentified woman who promised him a juicy scoop on Mayor Charles Bowles and all of his corruption, which she said would make a great story for the Buckley Hour. Around 1:20 that morning, Jerry Buckley's wife, Jeanette, received a phone call which, to her shock, a female voice coldly stated that her husband would not be returning home that night before hanging up.
After finishing his broadcast, Buckley headed to the hotel lobby, sat in a chair, and began reading the newspaper whilst he waited for his mysterious caller. Moments later, at approximately 1:30 in the morning, 3 gunmen burst into the lobby and opened fire, unloading 11 bullets into Buckley. He died instantly. From an 11th floor window overlooking the hotel, WNBC radio engineer William Martin witnessed the killers fleeing the scene in a waiting car. Martin later identified the assailants as members of the Purple Gang. However, fearing retribution, Martin soon resigned from his position and left Detroit. Without his testimony, the investigation stalled, and the murder of Jerry Buckley became yet another unsolved case in the violent history of Detroit's underworld. Despite two of their highest-ranking members, Keywell and Rader, now spending life behind bars and the bodies racking up on the streets of Detroit in an alarming manner, the gang continued to flourish, and by 1931, the Purple Gang dominated Detroit's criminal underworld. Their grip on the city's illegal operations seemed unshakable until three Chicago gunmen, Joseph Lebovitz, Jaime Paul and Izzy Sutka, arrived in the city and began testing the gang's authority. The trio had fled Chicago after targeting speakeasy operators for protection money, unknowingly shaking down establishments aligned with Al Capone's liquor syndicate. Once Capone discovered their activities, he issued a blunt ultimatum: leave Chicago willingly or leave in a coffin. Unsurprisingly, they chose the former and relocated to Detroit. In Detroit, the men initially aligned themselves with the smaller Purple Gang faction, the Little Jewish Navy, the group infamous for smuggling liquor across the Canadian border. However, the relationship quickly soured. Lebovitz, Paul and Sutka began hijacking Purple Gang liquor shipments and extorting other local gangsters, blatantly disregarding established territorial boundaries. Their ruthless actions earned them the nickname as the Third Avenue Terrors. With aspirations to carve out their own piece of Detroit's underworld, they directly challenged the supremacy of the Purple Gang, an audacious move that would not go unanswered.
By 1931, tensions between the Purple Gang and the 3rd Street Terrors had reached a boiling point. When the Terrors refused to pay back a significant amount of money for alcohol they'd stolen from the gang, Ray Bernstein devised a plan to eliminate them once and for all. He enlisted Sol Levine, a trusted friend of both groups, to act as an unsuspecting accomplice. Ray Bernstein convinced Sol Levine to lure Lebovitz, Sutka and Paul to a meeting under the false pretense that Ray Bernstein wanted to employ them as agents in the Purple Gang's extremely lucrative liquor business.
On September the 16th, 1931, the meeting took place at an apartment in the Collingwood Manor Apartments at 1740 Collingwood Avenue. As the men gathered, Bernstein excused himself, explaining that he had left his cigarettes in his car outside. When he reached the getaway car in this alley and saw that the coast was clear, he signalled to the others with the sound of the car backfiring and a honk from the car's horn. Inside the apartment, that cue meant that gang member Harry Fleischner could suddenly draw a .38 caliber revolver and shoot Lebovitz point blank. Harry Keywell and Irving Milberg followed, opening fire on Paul and Sutka. The room erupted with chaos as the three men dropped to the ground, riddled with bullets, while Levine, frozen with fear, watched the massacre unfold. Once the men were dead, Bernstein, Keywell, Milberg and Fleischer fled the scene, leaving Levine as the sole survivor and witness. To erase evidence, the gang attempted to deface the serial numbers on the murder weapons and dump them in paint in the apartment. Despite these efforts, a ballistics test confirmed the gun's connection to the crime. Under intense police interrogation, Levine confessed and identified the perpetrators. Soon after, detectives received an anonymous tip that two of the suspects were hiding at the Graceland Ballroom in Lupton, some 200 miles north of Detroit. Armed officers raided the location and arrested Ray Bernstein and Harry Keywell in their pajamas. The following night, Irving Milberg and Harry Fleischer were apprehended whilst also preparing to flee the city. The trial began on September the 30th, 1931, and Sol Levine took the stand despite palpable fear of retaliation. Protected by 8 detectives and flanked by 10 more in the courtroom, Levine nervously recounted the events of the massacre, never once looking at the accused men, who glared at him throughout the proceedings. Witnesses corroborated Levine's account, testifying that they had seen the defendants fleeing the apartment after the gunfire.
The formal trial commenced on November 2nd, 1931, with heightened security surrounding Levine as he provided a critical testimony. Abe Bernstein realised that killing Levine was not possible with the amount of police protection he had, so he and the rest of the Purple Gang did their best to intimidate jurors, sending them death threats and following them home as they were escorted by the police. However, it was to no avail. After deliberating for just over an hour and a half, the jury returned their verdict. All 4 men were found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. They were transferred to Marquette Prison to serve their sentences.
The convictions marked a pivotal moment in Detroit's criminal history. Chief of Detectives James McCarty hailed the outcome, stating, "This conviction is the greatest accomplishment in years. Not only does it break the back of the Purple Gang, but it serves notice to other mobs that murder doesn't go anymore in Detroit." Abe Bernstein assumed complete control of the gang after his brother Ray was sentenced to life in prison. After the massacre, the heat on the gang was unbearable, and Joe and Izzy Bernstein decided to relocate to California to escape it, leaving the criminal life behind. Abe, now 38, was left to pick up the pieces after 3 high-ranking members of the gang were now sentenced to life behind bars, and he best pick up the pieces fast because it wouldn't be long before the unrest and internal conflict resumed once more. Milford Jones, a notorious contract killer from St. Louis, was brought into Detroit as part of a contingent hired by the Purple Gang to exert out-of-town muscle. After his mentor, Fred the Killer Burke, was sentenced to life in Marquette Prison for the murder of a policeman in St. Joseph, Milford remained in Detroit, aligning himself with the Purple Gang. He quickly earned a reputation as a ruthless enforcer, feared by Detroit's mafia, some of whom Milford Jones had previously driven out of St. Louis. Many of those same mafia figures had since risen to prominence in Detroit's East Side mob, creating an uneasy dynamic in the city. Jones carried a deep-seated grudge over Sicilian and Italian gangsters, a vendetta that was as personal as it was professional. Over his brief career, Milford Jones was rumoured to have killed at least 29 mafia affiliates. His unchecked aggression didn't sit well with Purple Gang leader Abe Bernstein, who repeatedly warned Jones to stop targeting mafia-backed speakeasies, gambling dens and brothels. But Jones dismissed these warnings, continuing to extort and rob mafia-protected establishments. He fancied himself an independent operator, attempting to build his own criminal enterprise rather than remaining a subordinate to the Purples, which would prove a critical misjudgment. On June the 15th, 1932, at 4 a.m, Jones walked unarmed into the Stork Club, a well-known Purple Gang haunt located at 47 Rowena Street. Approaching the bar, he casually ordered a drink and rested his foot on the brass rail. As he glanced into the mirror behind the bar, he saw 4 men closing in. Before he could react, the men fired without hesitation, 2 gunmen unloading their weapons. Jones took 3 bullets to the head and several more to his body before collapsing. His right foot caught in the brass rail as he fell and died where he landed. Jones's death signalled the beginning of the end for the Purple Gang. The repeal of Prohibition loomed, and the lucrative, illegal liquor trade that had sustained the gang was rapidly disintegrating. The economic devastation of the Great Depression compounded their struggles. Due to their profits quickly drying out, Two members of the gang, Abe Axler and Eddie Fletcher, known as the Siamese twins due to their inseparable bond, attempted to muscle their way into Detroit's narcotics trade, controlled by the mafia in the form of Joe Zerilli and Black Bill Tocco's East Side gang. Zerilli and Tocco demanded retribution, and to prevent a gang war, Abe Bernstein had to take drastic measures. Early on the Sunday morning of November the 26th, 1933, Abe Axler and Eddie Fletcher were taken for a ride. Their bodies were discovered in the backseat of a Chrysler sedan registered to Axler. Each had been shot 5 times. Fletcher suffered wounds to his arm, chest and face from a .38 revolver, whilst Axler was executed with 5 shots to the head from a .45 automatic. The two were posed holding hands, a calculated insult meant to mock their inseparable nature in death.
The discovery of their bodies on Quarton Road, near the affluent Bloomfield Township, shocked the underworld. Oakland County detective failed to find much evidence at the scene apart from spent cartridge cases and slugs retrieved from the victims. No one was ever charged with the murders, but their deaths dealt a severe blow to the Purple Gang's already fragile power structure. Rival factions circled like vultures to carve up the remnants of what was left of the Purple Gang's territory.
The Purple Gang's decline was inevitable. Abe Bernstein, once the architect of their criminal empire, found himself unable to hold it together alone, being the only Bernstein left. The repeal of Prohibition on December 5th, 1933, making booze now legal again, further sealed the gang's fate. While some bootleggers transitioned to legitimate businesses, others faded into obscurity. Bernstein retained control over the Purple Gang's number rackets and horse racing wire service for a time, but the gang's glory days were over. The mafia was growing stronger as more and more of the Purples were either murdered, locked up, or simply left the criminal life behind. Detroit's underworld was changing, and the Purple Gang's reign had come to an end. By the mid-1930s, the Purple Gang's dominance over Detroit's underworld had all but vanished. What remained of their once expansive numbers racket and racetrack wire service was now handed over to the East Side Mafia, a strategic move by Abe Bernstein to avoid a gang war the Purples were ill-equipped to win. Historically, the Purple Gang had maintained cooperative ties with the Mafia, partnering in various illicit ventures. However, as their influence waned, a handful of die-hard members attempted to operate independently, leveraging the gang's notorious name to build their own crews. Harry Millman was one such man. By 1935, Millman emerged as a defiant figure in Detroit's criminal underworld, having broken off from the remaining members of the Purple Gang and earning him the moniker of a lone wolf. The mafia underbosses Pete Licciavoli and Joe Bomarito, frustrated by Millman's relentless provocations, approached Abe Bernstein, demanding action. Even though Millman wasn't a Purple Gang member anymore, the mafia threatened to wipe out Bernstein and his remaining operations unless Millman was killed. Despite Bernstein's repeated warnings for Millman to back down, the lone wolf refused to listen. Matters came to a head in 1936 when Millman and Joe Bomarito clashed in a brutal fistfight at Sam Finazzo's cafe on 8th and 4th Streets. Millman emerged victorious, further humiliating Bomarito, who vowed revenge. It was clear that Bernstein had to take action or risk what little he had left being absorbed by the mafia. Flush with newfound wealth from his rackets, Harry Millman began flaunting his success. He purchased a luxurious maroon Cadillac LaSalle V8 touring sedan and adorned himself in expensive suits. His growing arrogance led to bold actions, such as escorting Hattie Fleischer, the wife of imprisoned Purple Gang member Harry Fleischer, to the upscale 1040 Club located at 1040 Wayne Street for an evening of dining and dancing. Millman sent Hattie home in a cab after their night out, but as he waited for his men at 3 a.m, tragedy struck. The club's valet, Willie Holmes, bringing Millman's car round to him, turned on the ignition of the Cadillac, triggering an explosion of 7 sticks of dynamite wired to the car's spark plug. The blast shattered windows in nearby buildings, triggered burglar alarms, and flung the hood of the car onto the roof of a 5-story building. Willie Holmes, critically injured in the explosion, succumbed to his wounds later that day, marking Detroit's first car bomb killing.
The bombing made Millman a pariah amongst hotel owners who feared that their establishments would be the next site of his inevitable demise. Undeterred, Millman spiralled further out of control, culminating in a drunken rampage during which he shot up a mafia-protected brothel. This was just one example of his ridiculously reckless behaviour, which made even his closest associates believe that he harboured a death wish.
Frequenting Boski's Delicatessen, which featured an adjoining cocktail lounge, Millman's nocturnal drinking binges became predictable patterns for his enemies. On Thanksgiving morning, on November the 25th, 1937, Millman, accompanied by 2 friends, was drinking at Boski's cocktail lounge. Shortly before 1 a.m, Millman approached the bar to order more drinks. 2 men dressed in dark snap-brim hats and tan polo coats entered from the delicatessen. Millman was killed instantly, collapsing to the floor before he could react. As patrons of the bar dove for cover, the gunmen continued firing, wounding several others, including Harry Gross, a friend of Millman's and another ex-member of the Purples, who succumbed to his injuries days later. For Detroit law enforcement, Harry Millman's murder symbolised the end of the Purple Gang in its entirety. They vowed that no longer would they terrorise the streets or tarnish the city's police force with bribery and corruption as they had done during the 20s and the first half of the 1930s. The gang's era of blood-soaked dominance had come to a definitive close.
The police launched a full-scale attack at what was left of the Purple Gang after Harry Millman's murder, and many members sought legitimate or semi-legitimate ventures as a result of police pressure. Whilst others faded into obscurity, 26 members were incarcerated for extended periods, while 16 met violent ends, often at the hands of fellow Purple Gang members. The repeal of Prohibition further accelerated the gang's decline as the once thriving bootlegging economy collapsed. Legitimate industries tied to alcohol production, such as distilleries and breweries, now took centre stage, creating jobs and revitalising local economies. Speakeasies and blind pigs transformed into legitimate establishments, leaving little room for the Purple Gang's criminal enterprises.
The Purple Gang is a classic tale of crime doesn't pay, for the most part. The fates of most of the notable members of the gang proves this. Ray Bernstein never left prison after his role in the Collingwood massacre. He died in his cell in 1966 at the age of 63. Irving Milberg also faced a tragic end. 7 years after being sentenced to life in 1938 for his involvement in the same massacre, he underwent surgery for a bowel obstruction but died from complications of it at just 35 years old. Harry Keywell, however, was one of the fortunate ones. After serving 34 years in Jackson State Prison in Marquette, Michigan, he was released in 1965 at the age of 54. He relocated to Palm Beach, Florida, where he lived a quiet life until his death in 1997 at the age of 86. Joseph and Izzy Bernstein avoided both prison and murder. They never returned to Detroit, opting instead for quiet lives in California. Izzy passed away in 1969 at the age of 63, whilst Joe lived until 1984, reaching the age of 84. For many others, the outcome was far more grim. Phil Keywell, Morris Rader, and Harry and Sam Fleischer were all sentenced to life in prison for murder. None of them ever regained their freedom, and they all died behind bars. The gang's internal strife also led to a series of assassinations. Ziggy Selbin, Eddie Fletcher, Abe Axler, Harry Millman, Irving Shapiro and Milford Jones all met violent ends at the hands of their former associates. The only member who managed to outmaneuver both the law and his enemies was Abe Bernstein, the gang's most prominent, recognisable and cunning figure. By 1935, Bernstein orchestrated a calculated retreat, brokering a deal with mafia leaders Joe Zerilli and Black Bill Tocco. He relinquished control of his gambling empire in exchange for financial security. Bernstein lived in luxury for the rest of his life, residing in the penthouse of Detroit's prestigious Buck Cadillac Hotel until his death from a heart attack in 1968.
By the onset of World War II in 1939, the Purple Gang had largely faded from public consciousness. The looming global conflict overshadowed their notoriety, relegating their infamy to a distant memory. Subsequent investigations into organised crime in the early 1950s barely mentioned the gang, highlighting their minimal long-term impact. They were once the formidable gang in Detroit's underworld, but these days it seems that the Purple Gang have been all but forgotten. But let's not forget, of all those big Jewish gangsters from this era, Meyer Lansky, Dutch Schultz, Bugsy Siegel, not one of them formed or headed a family that ruled a city. Only the Purple Gang did that. Albeit momentarily, let's not forget that the Purple Gang were the only Jewish criminal faction to completely control a city's underworld, which I believe is a crazy legacy to leave behind and a good reason to make a documentary on them. Speaking of which, thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Please leave a like if you enjoyed it, comment, subscribe. I think that's everything. Thanks again for watching. Again, I really do appreciate it, and I shall see you in the next one.